The afternoon sun pressed down on the campus lawn, warm and relentless, as rows of graduates shifted in their seats, blue gowns whispering against plastic chairs. Programs fluttered like tired birds in the hands of proud families, and every few minutes the auditorium filled with applause that echoed longer than it should have. I sat beside my wife, my knees stiff, my palms resting politely on my thighs, watching the stage with the quiet patience that comes from years of learning when to speak and when to stay silent. When my stepdaughter's name was called, the noise rose instinctively. I stood, clapped, smiled. She adjusted the microphone, scanned the crowd, and thanked her professors, her friends, and then her father. Not me. Just him. The word landed gently for everyone else, but inside me it struck with the dull weight of something familiar. I kept my smile steady. I applauded at the right moments. From the outside, I imagine I looked exactly as a supportive parent should. Inside, there was a small tightening, an ache I had learned to carry without letting it show. I told myself that this was how it had always been, and how it was meant to be. I thought that would be the end of it. Then she paused. The silence stretched, awkward and unexpected, heavier than the applause that had come before, and in that suspended moment, I felt something shift, quietly altering what I believed I understood about gratitude and recognition that day. I met my wife later in life, at an age when promises were no longer spoken lightly. She had a young daughter then, quiet, observant, already old enough to measure people by whether they stayed. When I asked her to marry me, there was no dramatic proposal, just a simple understanding that loving her meant accepting the child who came with her, fully and without condition. I did not see myself as replacing anyone. I saw myself as choosing responsibility. From the beginning, I believed that love was not something you announced. It was something you demonstrated, consistently, often invisibly. I believed in duty, in patience, in showing up even when no one was watching. Credit, I learned early, was optional. Stability was not. So I took my place quietly, filling the spaces that needed filling and leaving the spotlight untouched. Daily life settled into a rhythm. Morning school runs before traffic thickened. Tuition payments scheduled months in advance. Evenings spent at the kitchen table while homework spread like a small war zone between textbooks and half-finished snacks. On late nights, I left sandwiches outside her door when exams kept her awake. I never knocked. I never announced myself. I simply made sure what was needed was there. To most people, I existed somewhere in the background. At school events, teachers nodded politely but looked past me. At family gatherings, introductions framed me carefully, as if my title required explanation. I learned to smile through it, understanding that perception rarely reflects labor. What mattered was that the lights stayed on, the bills were paid, and the house remained steady. Her biological father drifted in and out of her life, appearing at milestones and disappearing in between. When he showed up, he carried a weight I never could, the authority of blood and the comfort of nostalgia. He brought gifts, took photos, made promises that sounded impressive in short bursts. I never competed. I never corrected the narrative. I stayed where I was most useful. There were moments when the imbalance pressed on me, usually in silence, usually late at night. But each time, I chose the same answer. This family needed calm more than it needed acknowledgement. My role was not to be celebrated. It was to be dependable. As graduation approached, the house filled with anticipation and small, practical preparations. Caps were ordered, schedules printed, seats reserved. I watched it all with a quiet pride, carrying years of unspoken effort into that single afternoon, una war. Of how much weight those years would suddenly demand to be recognized. I did not talk much about these things because talking would have made them feel transactional. Love, to me, was a long road walked without witnesses. I understood that stepping back gave her room to love her father without guilt, and her mother space to believe our home was balanced. I told myself that restraint was strength, that silence could be a form of care. Still, as the ceremony drew closer, memories gathered quietly. Each sacrifice lined up behind the next, patient, waiting. By the morning of graduation, The weight of those years sat gently but firmly on my chest, reminding me that even unspoken stories eventually arrive at moments when they must decide whether to remain hidden or finally ask to be heard. That afternoon, walking toward the ceremony, I carried all of it with me, unaware that a single pause would soon test whether quiet endurance could still find its place in the open. I believed then that dignity lived best unnoticed, and I was prepared to keep believing quietly. The weeks leading up to graduation passed with a strange mix of pride and quiet exhaustion. Tuition receipts sat neatly filed in a drawer, each one representing hours worked, plans postponed, and comforts willingly delayed. I never spoke of those sacrifices aloud. Funding her education was never framed as generosity, it was simply what needed to be done. Still, as the ceremony approached, I found myself revisiting those moments in my mind, not seeking praise, but wondering if effort ever leaves an imprint when it goes unnamed. Extended family called occasionally, asking about travel plans and seating arrangements. Their questions always circled back to her father. Would he be there? Was he excited? When they spoke to me, it was with polite warmth, the kind reserved for someone adjacent to the story rather than central to it. I learned to answer without bitterness, though each exchange quietly reinforced where I stood in their understanding of her success. Even acquaintances carried the same assumptions. Neighbors congratulated me in passing, then quickly asked if her dad was proud. At work, colleagues nodded approvingly, never questioning who had carried the financial weight. None of it was cruel. It was simply unexamined, and that made it harder to challenge. I told myself that recognition was not the goal. Stability had been. On the morning of graduation, I dressed carefully, choosing a suit that felt appropriate but unremarkable. My wife noticed my silence and squeezed my hand, a small gesture that acknowledged more than words ever could. Driving to the venue, I rehearsed nothing. I prepared myself for invisibility the same way I always had, calmly, deliberately. As we took our seats, I became acutely aware of how many people were watching for reactions. Cameras turned toward faces expected to show pride, gratitude, and entitlement all at once. I reminded myself to remain present, to let the day belong fully to her. Any hope I carried was small and private, tucked away where disappointment could not easily reach it. The ceremony unfolded exactly as expected. Names were called, applause rose and fell, parents leaned forward with phones raised. When my stepdaughter stepped up, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, equal parts pride and restraint. I watched her smile, watched her steady her voice, already bracing for the moment I knew was coming. When she thanked her father, it was clear and unmistakable. There was no pause, no addition, no glance in my direction. The words landed cleanly, and the crowd responded on cue. Applause filled the space, generous and approving. I joined in, clapping with the same measured rhythm as everyone else, my smile practiced enough to pass unnoticed. Inside, something settled rather than broke. It was not anger that surfaced, nor embarrassment. It was resignation, shaped by years of choosing quiet over confrontation. I reminded myself that this moment was not about me, that love did not require acknowledgement to remain real. Still, as the applause continued, a thought passed through me with sharp clarity. They clapped, unaware of the checks written, the nights waited up for, the years quietly arranged around someone else's future. I did not shift in my seat. I did not look away. I stayed exactly where I was, holding my place with dignity because that was the role I had accepted long ago. The ache was familiar, manageable, woven into the fabric of how I understood family. I told myself this was the cost of peace, and that I had paid it willingly. Then something unexpected happened. She stopped speaking. The microphone picked up a small breath, the kind taken when someone is deciding whether to continue or retreat. The applause thinned and faded, replaced by a murmur of confusion. She stood there, eyes scanning the audience, hesitation visible in the way her shoulders tightened. In that brief pause, the weight of years pressed forward, and I sensed, without understanding how, that the story was no longer moving in the direction I had prepared myself for at all. As she stood there in that suspended silence, my thoughts moved backward, weaving through years I rarely allowed myself to examine all at once. I had trained myself to believe that restraint was a form of love, that staying quiet protected everyone else from unnecessary discomfort. In that moment, surrounded by hundreds of people who did not know me, I felt the weight of every time I had chosen silence over recognition rise gently to the surface. I remembered nights when the house emptied of sound, when even her bedroom door was closed and the world felt paused. The kitchen light stayed on while I sat alone at the table, bills spread out in orderly stacks. Tuition statements, lab fees, housing deposits, books that cost more than they should have. I paid them slowly, deliberately, as if the rhythm itself mattered. There was no resentment in those moments, only resolve. This was part of the road I had chosen, and I walked it without needing an audience. Sometimes, on my way to bed, I would pass the hallway closet and notice her graduation gown hanging there, untouched, still sealed in its plastic. It felt like a promise waiting patiently. I never took it down or adjusted it. I just made sure it remained safe, protected, ready. The house often felt larger than necessary then, quiet in a way that made thoughts louder. Yet there was purpose in that quiet, the sense that unseen effort still held everything upright. Years earlier, my wife and I had talked late one night, when honesty seemed easier than pretending everything balanced itself. We agreed on boundaries that night, spoken carefully, without bitterness. I would never compete with her father, never challenge his place, no matter how inconsistently he occupied it. I would not correct assumptions or seek validation. Stability mattered more than acknowledgement. That agreement became a private contract I honored without exception. Whenever doubt crept in, I returned to the same thought, repeating it until it steadied me. If she succeeds, that is enough. It guided decisions that were invisible to everyone else. It reminded me that love did not need witnesses to be real. Her progress, her safety, her confidence mattered more than my recognition. Back in the auditorium, the light shifted almost imperceptibly as clouds passed across the sun. Bright patches softened into shadow, and the room seemed to lean inward. Programs stopped fluttering. People adjusted in the IR seats, sensing that something unscheduled was unfolding. The pause at the podium stretched, no longer awkward but intentional. I remained still, my hands folded neatly, eyes fixed forward. Years of endurance had taught me how to wait without expectation. I did not search her face or prepare myself for disappointment. I trusted the silence the same way I had trusted time, believing that whatever followed would arrive when it was meant to. As the seconds lengthened, the hall grew quiet in a way applause never achieves. The microphone waited. The light continued to change. And I felt, deep in my chest, that the long habit of standing back was about to meet a moment that would ask whether quiet commitment could finally step into the open. She lifted the microphone again, but this time her hands trembled slightly. Her eyes moved across the rows of faces, no longer scanning for familiarity but searching for something harder to name. The room had gone so quiet that even small movements sounded too loud. When she spoke, her voice wavered, just enough to reveal that what came next had not been rehearsed. She said she needed to say something else, something she should have said the first time. A ripple moved through the audience, subtle but unmistakable. People leaned forward. I felt my spine stiffen, instinctively preparing for disappointment even as curiosity tugged at me. I kept my gaze fixed on the stage, my expression unchanged, reminding myself that expectation had never served me well. She took a breath and continued, her words coming more slowly now. She spoke about the long years that led to this moment, about the late nights and quiet mornings that never made it into photographs. Then she said my name, clearly, without hesitation. The sound of it seemed to echo differently than everything else that day. She talked about the rides to school, the patience during difficult semesters, the man who never asked for credit but made sure nothing ever fell apart. She spoke about tuition paid without complaint, about encouragement offered privately, about a steady presence that did not disappear when things were inconvenient. With each sentence, the room shifted. Murmurs replaced silence. Heads turned, first subtly, then openly. I felt something tighten in my chest, a sensation halfway between disbelief and relief. My hands curled slightly in my lap as I focused on breathing evenly. Tears threatened, but I held them back, not out of pride, but habit. Emotion, like recognition, was something I had learned to manage quietly. As she spoke, I became aware of movement a few seats away. Her father sat frozen, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable at first. Then his eyes dropped, and something softened in his shoulders. It was not anger I saw there, nor resentment. It was recognition, perhaps, or the weight of realizing that presence is measured over time, not moments. The audience responded gradually, as if unsure how to react to a truth that had arrived unexpectedly. Applause began hesitantly, then gathered strength, not loud or explosive, but deliberate. It felt different from the applause before. Slower. More considered. I sensed attention turning toward me, but I did not look back. I kept my focus on her, on the courage it took to speak honestly in front of so many. Inside, memories collided with the present. Late nights. Quiet mornings. Choices made without witnesses. All of it rose and settled at once, forming something solid and warm. I realized then that acknowledgement did not erase the years of silence, but it gave them shape. It allowed them to exist openly, without diminishing the reasons they had been made. She finished by saying thank you again, this time with clarity and intention. Her voice steadied, strengthened by the truth she had chosen to share. When she stepped back from the microphone, the applause filled the room fully, not as celebration, but as recognition. I remained seated as the sound washed over me, my ex. Press-ion calm, my heart anything but. Dignity, I understood in that moment, did not arrive with noise or triumph. It arrived quietly, restoring balance without demanding repayment. As the applause slowly faded, I noticed how different it felt in my body. It was no longer something I joined politely. It was something I absorbed, deeply and sincerely, knowing that nothing had been taken from anyone else for me to finally be seen. When the ceremony finally ended, the room loosened all at once, conversations rising cautiously as if people were unsure how loudly to return to normal. My wife turned toward me first. She didn't say anything. She simply leaned in and wrapped her arms around me, holding on a second longer than usual. In that embrace, I felt years of shared restraint acknowledged without a single word spoken. Around us, faces softened. Relatives approached more slowly than they had earlier, their smiles less automatic, their eyes more searching. Some offered brief congratulations, others quiet nods that carried the weight of realization. No one apologized directly, but something unspoken passed between us, a recalibration happening without announcement. A few moments later, my stepdaughter found me away from the crowd, near the edge of the hall where the noise thinned. She stood in front of me, cap tilted slightly, eyes still bright from emotion. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she hugged me, tight and sincere, the kind of embrace that carries intention rather than obligation. She thanked me softly. Nothing more. No explanations. No defenses. Just gratitude, offered plainly. I nodded and told her how proud I was, because that had always been the truth. I did not list what I had done. I did not fill the space with correction or memory. The moment did not need it. As we walked back toward the others, I felt no urge to linger in the attention that followed. There was no sense of victory in being right, no satisfaction in contrast. What I felt instead was relief. Being seen did not elevate me above anyone else. It simply placed me where I had always stood, now visible. Her father approached later, offering a handshake that turned into an awkward half-embrace. His words were brief, his tone subdued. I accepted them without comment. There was nothing to claim, nothing to resolve publicly. The story had already settled itself. That evening, after the house quieted and the day finally released its hold, I sat alone in the living room. The graduation gown hung nearby, no longer just a promise, but a memory fulfilled. I thought about how easily the moment could have passed unnoticed, and how quietly it had changed everything. I realized then that recognition mattered less than understanding, and that dignity, once restored, does not ask to be repeated. In the weeks that followed, nothing about our lives changed dramatically, and yet everything felt subtly different. My stepdaughter began calling more often, not with grand announcements, but with ordinary questions. She asked my opinion on work decisions, sent photos of small milestones, shared frustrations she once kept to herself. There was no sudden closeness, no emotional overhaul. Just a steady deepening, like a relationship finally allowed to breathe at its own pace. My role did not expand, and it did not need to. I continued to show up the way I always had, quietly, consistently, without expectation. The difference was not in my actions, but in how they were received. A glance held longer. A thank you spoken without hesitation. Recognition did not change my intent, it simply removed the invisibility that had once surrounded it. As time passed, I reflected more often on what fatherhood truly meant. It was not about being first or being loud. It was not about titles or public acknowledgments. It was about endurance. About staying when staying was unremarkable. About choosing responsibility even when no one was keeping score. Legacy, I realized, is rarely built in moments that draw applause. It is built quietly, in repetition, in reliability. I thought about the years I had spent believing that love worked best when it asked for nothing. That belief had guided me through doubt and silence, and it had not failed me. Love that demands nothing creates space for honesty. It allows others to arrive at truth without being pushed. And when that truth finally comes, it carries a weight no argument ever could. There were moments afterward when I caught myself revisiting that pause at the podium, not with longing, but with understanding. It had not been a reward. It had been a recognition of something that already existed. The years before it still mattered. The years after it mattered too. I did not need the moment to repeat itself. Once was enough. It settled something inside me that no amount of explanation ever could. I learned that day that gratitude, like truth, arrives exactly when it's ready.